The sun shone brightly that Saturday morning as Eleanor Johnson prepared breakfast for her 3 grandchildren. At 62, these weekend visits were the highlight of her week. Her small kitchen filled with laughter as the kids told her about their school projects and basketball games. Eleanor watched them with pride, her silver-streaked hair pulled back neatly, her eyes warm behind reading glasses that hung on a chain around her neck. "Who wants to go to the park today?" she asked, clearing away the pancake plates. The children cheered, racing to get their jackets. Eleanor smiled, grabbing her purse and car keys. These simple joys, taking her grandkids to feed ducks and play on swings, meant everything to her. 20 minutes later, Eleanor drove carefully through her neighborhood, checking her rearview mirror as she always did. Her oldest grandchild, 12-year-old Thomas, sat beside her while Zoe, 9, and little Kevin, 7, chatted in the back. Eleanor noticed a police car several cars behind her. She didn't think much of it until it followed her turn after turn, getting closer. "Grandma, I think that police car is following us," Thomas said, turning to look back. "I'm sure they're just on patrol, honey," Eleanor replied, though a familiar knot formed in her stomach, one she'd felt many times before in her 62 years. The flashing lights came on as she approached an intersection. Eleanor sighed, signaling properly and pulling over to the curb. She'd done nothing wrong, no speeding, no rolling through stop signs, nothing. "Why are we stopping, Grandma?" Zoe asked from the back seat. "The police want to talk to us for a minute," Eleanor explained calmly. "Everything's fine. Just stay quiet and still, okay?" Eleanor watched in her side mirror as 2 officers stepped out of their vehicle. Both white men, one tall and lean, the other shorter with broad shoulders. Their hands rested near their weapons as they approached, a detail that didn't escape Eleanor's notice. She placed both hands on the steering wheel where they could be clearly seen. The tall officer tapped on her window. Eleanor pressed the button to roll it down, smiling politely. "Good morning, officer," she said. "Is there a problem?" "License and registration," he demanded without greeting, his tone sharp. Eleanor kept her voice steady. "May I ask why I've been pulled over?" The officer's face hardened. "License and registration first, then we'll get to that." In the back seat, Kevin began to fidget, sensing the tension. "It's okay, sweetheart," Eleanor said over her shoulder before turning back to the officer. "I understand you need to see my documents, but I believe I have the right to know why I'm being stopped." The second officer moved closer, his expression darkening. "Ma'am, when an officer gives you an instruction, you follow it. Not doing so can be considered obstruction." Eleanor felt her grandchildren's fear growing. Thomas sat frozen beside her. Zoe had stopped chattering. Kevin's lower lip trembled. "Of course, officers," Eleanor said, reaching slowly for her purse. "I just want to understand the reason." "Step out of the vehicle," the first officer suddenly ordered, his hand moving to his belt. "Excuse me." Eleanor's heart raced, but her voice remained calm. "I don't understand why that's necessary. My grandchildren." Before she could finish, the officer yanked open her door. "Out, now. Grandma." Kevin's small voice cracked with fear. "It's okay, baby," Eleanor said, though it clearly wasn't. Neighbors had begun to notice, some stepping onto their porches, others slowing their cars. Eleanor carefully unbuckled her seatbelt. "Thomas, honey, take my phone," she whispered, sliding it toward him. "If anything happens, call your mama." As Eleanor slowly stepped out of the car, the officer grabbed her arm roughly. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back." "Officer, please," Eleanor said. "My grandchildren are watching. I've done nothing wrong." "Resisting arrest," the second officer declared, moving in. "Arrest? On what charge?" Eleanor asked as cold metal handcuffs closed around her wrists. Through the car window, she could see her grandchildren's terrified faces, tears streaming down little Kevin's cheeks. Thomas held the phone with shaking hands, already dialing. Neighbors had started recording with their phones. What none of these officers knew was exactly who they had just handcuffed in front of her traumatized grandchildren, and the storm that was about to break over their heads because of it. Eleanor stood on the sidewalk in handcuffs, the metal digging into her wrists. Her grandchildren pressed their faces against the car windows, their eyes wide with fear. Thomas, the oldest, held her phone tightly, whispering into it. Eleanor could tell he was talking to his mother. "What is going on here?" A neighbor called out from across the street. Mrs. Wilson, who had lived next door to Eleanor for 15 years, marched toward them in her gardening clothes. "Why are you handcuffing this woman?" "Ma'am, please step back. This is police business," the taller officer said sharply. Eleanor took a deep breath. "Officers, I still don't understand why I've been stopped or why I'm being detained. My grandchildren are frightened, and I need to make sure they're taken care of." The shorter officer ignored her concerns. "We received a report of a stolen vehicle matching this description in the area." Eleanor blinked in disbelief. "This car? I've owned this car for 8 years. The registration is in the glove compartment, as I was trying to tell you." More neighbors had gathered now. Someone was recording with a cell phone. Eleanor could hear little Kevin crying inside the car. "Turn around," the taller officer ordered, his hand firmly on her shoulder. "You're under arrest for resisting an officer and disorderly conduct." "Disorderly?" Eleanor kept her voice level, though her heart pounded. "I've been nothing but respectful. This is happening because I'm black, isn't it?" The officer tightened the handcuffs. "Don't make this about race." Another police car pulled up. Eleanor noticed one of the officers had his body camera on. Thank goodness, she thought. Let them record everything. "My grandchildren," Eleanor said again, louder this time. "They cannot be left alone in that car. They're minors. You have a legal obligation to ensure their safety." The officers exchanged glances. The one with the body camera approached cautiously. "What's going on here, Richards?" Suspect was uncooperative during a traffic stop. The taller officer, Richards, replied. "Refused to provide license and registration." "That's not true," Eleanor said firmly. "I asked why I was being stopped, which is my right. I was reaching for my documents when he ordered me out of the car." More people had gathered. Some were taking photos. Others were shouting at the officers. Eleanor could see Thomas on the phone, his face streaked with tears as he tried to comfort his younger siblings. "Please," Eleanor said to the newly arrived officer. "My name is Eleanor Johnson. I've lived in this neighborhood for 20 years. Call my daughter to come get the children. Her number is in my phone, which my grandson has." The new officer looked uncomfortable. "Richards, can we talk for a second?" As they stepped away, Eleanor heard snippets of their conversation. "Know who this is?" "Doesn't matter who." "Board member." "Started it by being uncooperative." Eleanor closed her eyes briefly. So that was it. The new officer recognized her name but was being overruled. She straightened her back despite the discomfort of the cuffs. Mrs. Wilson approached again. "I'm calling the chief directly," she said to Eleanor. "This is outrageous." "Thank you," Eleanor replied softly. "Please just make sure my grandchildren are okay." The officers returned. Richards looked annoyed but determined. "You're still under arrest, ma'am. We're taking you to the station." "What about my grandchildren?" Eleanor demanded. "We'll have child services." "Absolutely not," Mrs. Wilson interrupted. "I'll stay with them until their parents arrive. I'm their neighbor and Eleanor's friend for 15 years. The third officer nodded, seemingly relieved at this solution. Eleanor locked eyes with her grandchildren. "It's going to be okay," she called to them. "Mrs. Wilson will stay with you until your mom comes. I'll be home soon." Little Kevin pressed his palm against the window. Zoe was crying now too. Only Thomas seemed to understand, nodding at his grandmother's words. As the officers led Eleanor to the patrol car, she held her head high. People were recording from all directions now. She could hear angry voices, questions being shouted at the officers. "This isn't right. What did she do? Why are you arresting her?" Eleanor ducked her head to enter the police car. As the door closed behind her, she caught a glimpse of her car, her frightened grandchildren, and the growing crowd of witnesses. The officers had made a terrible mistake today. They had no idea who they were dealing with or what would happen next. As the patrol car pulled away, Eleanor's mind was already racing, planning her next steps. This was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. The police station buzzed with activity as Eleanor sat on a hard bench, her wrists still marked from the handcuffs they had finally removed. An officer typed at a nearby desk, occasionally glancing at her with an unreadable expression. Eleanor kept her back straight and her face calm, though her mind raced with worry about her grandchildren. Water. A young female officer approached, offering a paper cup. "Thank you," Eleanor said, accepting it with steady hands. "Has my daughter been notified that I'm here?" Before the officer could answer, the door to the station burst open. A tall man in an expensive suit walked in, his presence immediately commanding attention. He scanned the room, spotted Eleanor, and headed straight for her. "Eleanor, are you all right?" He knelt beside her, concern etched on his face. Judge Thompson, one of the desk officers, said, suddenly standing. "We didn't expect to see you here today, sir." Judge Thompson ignored him, focusing entirely on Eleanor. "I came as soon as David called me. This is outrageous." Eleanor nodded. "I'm okay, Robert. How are my grandchildren?" "With their mother, shaken but safe." He turned to face the officers, his expression hardening. "Now, who's the arresting officer, and who's the supervising officer on duty?" A door opened, and a man with captain's bars on his uniform emerged. "Judge Thompson, I was just about to call you. If you join me in my office—" "No," the judge said firmly. "Whatever needs to be said can be said right here, in front of Mrs. Johnson. I'm here as her friend and legal counsel." The station had gone oddly quiet. Officers who had been processing paperwork suddenly found reasons to step away. The arresting officer, Richards, stood in a corner, his face pale. "For those who don't know," Judge Thompson announced, his voice carrying across the room, "Mrs. Eleanor Johnson is not only a retired civil rights attorney who has argued 5 cases before the state Supreme Court, but she also currently serves on the Civilian Police Oversight Board that reviews officer conduct in this very department." Eleanor watched as the information rippled through the room. Some officers looked shocked, others uncomfortable. Richards looked like he might be sick. The captain cleared his throat. "Mrs. Johnson, on behalf of the department, I want to express our deepest—" "Save it," Eleanor said quietly but firmly. "What happened today isn't about me. It's about a system that allowed those officers to see a black grandmother with her grandchildren and assume criminality. If they treat me this way, someone with resources and connections, imagine how they treat others in our community who don't have a judge's personal phone number." Her phone buzzed. Eleanor glanced down to see a text from her son-in-law, David. "Video from 3 neighbors already. Channel 7 wants to interview you." Chief of police called twice. The captain was still talking, something about an internal investigation and immediate suspension of the officers involved. "My grandchildren watched me being handcuffed for absolutely nothing," Eleanor continued, cutting through his words. "My 7-year-old grandson cried himself to sleep tonight, afraid the police would come take his grandmother away again. That trauma doesn't disappear with an apology." The station door opened again. This time, a woman in a crisp blazer entered, followed by a man with a notebook. Eleanor recognized the police chief and the mayor's chief of staff. "Eleanor," the police chief said, hurrying over. "I just heard. This should never have happened." "But it did happen, Patricia," Eleanor replied. "And now we have to deal with it." Judge Thompson placed a hand on Eleanor's shoulder. "The paperwork for your release is being processed. David is waiting outside with a car." Eleanor nodded, then turned to address everyone. "I've spent 30 years fighting for justice in courtrooms. I've helped write policy for this very department. I've trained officers on community relations." She paused, making eye contact with several people around the room. "But today, none of that mattered. Today, I was just another black person considered dangerous until proven innocent." As she spoke, she noticed Richard slip away through a side door. The captain looked deeply uncomfortable. The chief was already on her phone, probably calling the mayor. "I'll be filing a formal complaint tomorrow," Eleanor continued, her voice gaining strength. "Not just about my treatment, but about the pattern of behavior these officers have demonstrated. This ends now." She stood smoothing her rumpled clothes with dignity. Judge Thompson stayed beside her, a protective presence. The station remained unusually silent as Eleanor walked toward the door, her head held high. Outside, camera lights flashed. News crews had already gathered. Her son-in-law David waited at the bottom of the steps, relief washing over his face when he saw her. "Grandma." Thomas broke away from his mother and ran to Eleanor, wrapping his arms around her waist. "You're okay." Eleanor hugged him tightly, tears finally threatening to spill. "Yes, baby, I'm okay." And those officers are about to learn just how okay I really am. By sunset, the crowd outside the police station had grown to over 100 people. Neighbors, church members, parents from the local school. They held handmade signs reading "Justice for Eleanor" and "Protect our grandmothers." News vans lined the street, reporters with microphones interviewing people from the community. Elena sat at her daughter Lisa's kitchen table, watching the live coverage on a tablet. Her grandchildren had finally fallen asleep upstairs after the exhausting day. Lisa poured her mother another cup of tea while David, her husband, paced the room, his phone constantly buzzing. "Channel 4 wants an exclusive," David said, glancing at his mother-in-law. "And the Tribune wants to run a front-page story tomorrow." "Mom, you don't have to talk to anyone tonight," Lisa said, squeezing Eleanor's hand. "You've been through enough." Eleanor took a sip of tea, considering. Those people out there deserve some acknowledgement. They've come out to support not just me, but what I represent. She looked at David. "Tell Channel 4 I'll give them 5 minutes. Live, from here." The doorbell rang. Lisa answered it, returning with Eleanor's neighbor Mrs. Wilson and Pastor Green from the community church. "The whole congregation is praying for you," Pastor Green said, taking Eleanor's hands in his. "And many of them are down at the station right now." Mrs. Wilson set down a casserole dish for the children's breakfast, "and to let you know we stand with you." Eleanor's phone chimed with yet another message. This one made her pause. "It's from the mayor," she said quietly. "He wants to meet tomorrow morning." David stopped pacing. "This is getting big, Eleanor, bigger than just those 2 officers." "It was always bigger than those 2 officers," Eleanor replied. "They're symptoms of a disease that's infected policing for generations." The doorbell rang again. This time, it was the Channel 4 news crew setting up quickly in the living room while Eleanor freshened up. Behind them came more neighbors with food, flowers, and offers of help. As the reporter adjusted her microphone, Eleanor glanced out the window. 3 cars down. A police cruiser sat watching the house. Not threatening, protective. The chief must have ordered it after the station incident. Eleanor smiled slightly at the irony. "We'll live in 30 seconds, the camera operator announced. Eleanor sat straight, composed yet determined. The reporter nodded encouragingly as the red light on the camera came on. "I'm here with Eleanor Johnson, the grandmother whose controversial arrest today has sparked protests across the city," the reporter began. "Mrs. Johnson, can you tell us what happened in your own words?" Eleanor looked directly into the camera. "Today, I was driving my grandchildren to the park when police officers pulled me over without cause. They refused to explain why, demanded my papers, and when I calmly asked for an explanation, they arrested me in front of my terrified grandchildren. And you believe this was racially motivated? The officers' body cameras will show they made racial comments before approaching my car," Eleanor said firmly. "But this isn't just about me. Every day in this city, black people are stopped, questioned, and harassed simply for existing. The difference is, most don't have my resources or connections." The reporter nodded. "You're a former civil rights attorney and currently serve on the Civilian Police Oversight Board. Do you think that's why this case is getting so much attention?" "It's getting attention because the community is tired," Eleanor replied. "Tired of pretending this doesn't happen. Tired of being told to just comply and you'll be fine. I did everything right today, and I was still handcuffed in front of my babies." Outside, car horns honked in support as more people arrived. Someone had started a candlelight vigil on the front lawn. "What do you want to happen now?" the reporter asked. Eleanor took a deep breath. "I want those officers held accountable. I want real change in police training and oversight. But mostly, I want my grandchildren to live in a world where they aren't afraid of the people sworn to protect them." As the interview ended, David showed Eleanor his phone. The hashtag Justice for Elena was trending nationwide. Videos of her arrest had been viewed over 1 million times. Celebrities were reposting and commenting. "Mom," Lisa said quietly, "this might be the case that finally makes a difference." Elena watched as the crowd outside continued to grow, candles flickering in the darkness. For years, she'd fought these battles in courtrooms and meeting rooms. Now, somehow, her personal trauma had become a rallying point, a chance to force the change she'd worked toward her entire career. "Get me my laptop," she told David. If we're going to do this, we're going to do it right. The whole system is about to be put on trial. Morning sunlight streamed through the windows of City Hall as Eleanor walked through the main entrance. She wore a simple blue dress and carried a leather portfolio that had seen her through 30 years of legal battles. Behind her walked Judge Thompson, her daughter Lisa, and David, who had taken the day off from his newspaper job. Security guards nodded respectfully, some even murmuring "Good morning, Mrs. Johnson," as she passed. The mayor waited in his office, standing when Eleanor entered. Police Chief Patricia Garcia sat beside him, along with the city attorney, looking uncomfortable. "Eleanor," the mayor said, extending his hand. "Thank you for coming. I want to personally apologize for what happened yesterday." Eleanor shook his hand firmly but didn't smile. "I'm not here for apologies, Michael. I'm here for action." They all sat down around a large oak table. An aide brought coffee, which Eleanor declined. "The officers have been placed on administrative leave," Chief Garcia began. "We're conducting a thorough internal investigation." "Internal investigations protect officers, not communities," Eleanor interrupted. She opened her portfolio and slid documents across the table. "This is what I'm proposing instead." The mayor picked up the papers, skimming through them with raised eyebrows. "This is comprehensive." "It should be. I've been drafting police reform policies for 20 years. Eleanor tapped the document. "I want an independent investigation, not just of these officers but of every complaint filed against them in the past 5 years. I want their body camera footage released to the public by noon today. And I want the department's racial profiling statistics for the last decade published on the city website." The city attorney frowned. "There are privacy concerns, union contracts. There's also a civil rights lawsuit that I'll file this afternoon if we don't reach an agreement," Eleanor said calmly. "And unlike most people your officers mistreat, I have the resources to see it through to the Supreme Court if necessary." David placed a folder on the table. "The Tribune is running this investigation regardless of what happens today. 6 months of data showing black drivers are 7 times more likely to be stopped in this city than white drivers." The room fell silent. Outside, they could hear chanting from the growing crowd gathered on the plaza. Chief Garcia sighed. "Eleanor, you know I've been trying to change things from the inside. But change takes time." "My grandchildren don't have time," Eleanor replied, her voice finally betraying emotion. "Little Kevin asked me this morning if the police were coming back to take Grandma away again. He's 7 years old, Patricia." "7. What do I tell him?" The mayor rubbed his forehead. "What exactly do you want?" Eleanor straightened in her chair. "Release the body cam footage. Suspend the officers without pay pending investigation. Create an emergency task force with actual power to implement reforms, not just suggest them." She paused. "And I want to lead it." The city attorney started to object, but the mayor held up his hand. "And if we do all that, then I'll work with you instead of against you." Eleanor's gaze was unwavering. "But understand, this isn't just about my case. This is about changing a system that treats black people as suspects first and citizens second." As they debated details, Eleanor's phone buzzed with texts from supporters outside. The crowd had grown to several hundred. 3 city council members had joined them. Finally, the mayor nodded. "We'll do it. The task force, the suspensions, all of it. But Eleanor, you need to help calm things down out there. This city can't handle riots." "Those aren't rioters, Michael. Those are voters," Eleanor said, standing. "And they're not angry because I told them to be. They're angry because what happened to me happens every day, just without cameras rolling." They worked out final details, and an hour later, Eleanor stood on the city hall steps beside the mayor as he announced the agreements to the crowd and press. The body camera footage would be released. The officers suspended without pay. A task force established with Eleanor as chair. As the mayor spoke, Eleanor looked out at the sea of faces, people of all colors holding signs, nodding, some wiping tears. She spotted her neighbor Mrs. Wilson near the front, her grandchildren's school principal, even her mail carrier. This wasn't just support for her. This was a community finding its voice. When it was her turn to speak, Eleanor stepped to the microphone. The crowd hushed. "Yesterday I was helpless," she began. "Today we are powerful. Tomorrow we will be justice." The crowd erupted in cheers. Behind her, The mayor and police chief exchanged nervous glances. They were starting to realize that Eleanor Johnson, grandmother, attorney, community leader, wouldn't be satisfied with half measures or symbolic gestures. This was just the beginning. Officer Richards sat alone in the dimly lit bar, staring at his untouched beer. The TV above the counter played the news, his body camera footage showing him yanking open Eleanor's car door, his partner making comments about these people always causing trouble before they even approached her vehicle. His face appeared on screen as the reporter discussed the officer's suspension without pay. His phone buzzed again. Another message from his mother. "Please call me. We need to talk about what I saw on the news." He ignored it, just like he ignored the last 5 calls. What could he possibly say to her? That he wasn't the racist cop the whole city now thought he was? The evidence was right there on video. The door to the bar opened and Officer Wilson, his partner during the arrest, walked in. His eyes were bloodshot, his uniform replaced by a wrinkled t-shirt. "Thought I might find you here," Wilson said, sliding onto the stool beside Richards. "Police union called. They're backing off. Won't be covering our legal fees." Richards finally took a sip of his beer. "Why would they? We're toxic now." "It wasn't my fault," Wilson said, his voice rising. "You're the one who escalated things. I was just backing my partner." A few heads turned their way. Someone whispered, and Richards knew they'd been recognized. "Keep your voice down," he muttered. "Why?" "Everyone already knows who we are." Wilson ordered a whiskey, downing it in one gulp. 22 years on the force. Spotless record. And now this. Richards wanted to argue that they'd done nothing wrong. They were just doing their jobs, following procedure. But the words stuck in his throat. He'd watched the footage too. Heard his own voice, saw his own actions. It was indefensible. His phone buzzed with a text from the chief, Internal Affairs. "Tomorrow, 9 a.m. Bring representation." Across town, Eleanor sat in her living room with Thomas, her oldest grandson. On the coffee table between them lay his homework, an essay titled My Hero with Eleanor's name at the top. "Can I really write about what happened?" Thomas asked, pencil hovering over the paper. "Won't I get in trouble at school?" Eleanor smiled gently. "The truth doesn't get you in trouble, sweetheart. Not in the long run. Tell it like you saw it." The doorbell rang. Lisa answered it, returning with an uncomfortable-looking man in his 40s. "Mom," she said quietly, "this is Officer Bell. He was there at the station when they brought you in. He says he needs to talk to you." Eleanor nodded, asking Thomas to continue his homework in the kitchen. Officer Bell remained standing, twisting his hat in his hands. "Mrs. Johnson, I've come on my own. My superiors don't know I'm here." He took a deep breath. "I want to testify about the pattern of behavior I've witnessed from Officers Richards and Wilson over the past 3 years." Eleanor studied him carefully. "Why now?" "Because my daughter asked me the same question your grandson asked you." "Dad, aren't you one of the bad cops?" He looked down. I couldn't answer her, and that told me everything I needed to know about myself. The next morning, the police station buzzed with unusual activity. Internal Affairs investigators moved between offices, collecting files. Officers clustered in small groups, conversations stopping whenever someone walked by. In the conference room, Eleanor sat with Judge Thompson and 2 civil rights attorneys as Officer Bell described incidents he'd witnessed. "They called it hunting in the dark neighborhood," he said quietly. "Thursday nights, they'd drive through the east side looking for any reason to stop people." The lead investigator made notes. "And you're willing to testify to this under oath?" Bell nodded. "Yes, and I'm not the only one. 2 other officers are ready to come forward." Outside the station, protesters still gathered daily. The national news had picked up the story, showing side-by-side images of Eleanor in handcuffs and Elena in her judicial robes from her time as a civil rights attorney. The hashtag Justice for Elena had millions of posts. On day 7 after the incident, the district attorney called a press conference. Cameras flashed as she approached the podium. "After reviewing all available evidence, my office is filing criminal charges against Officers James Richards and Peter Wilson for filing false police reports, civil rights violations, and official misconduct." The crowd erupted with cheers and applause. The DA raised her hands for quiet. This case has revealed deeper issues within our police department, and we are expanding our investigation accordingly. She paused, making eye contact with the cameras. No one is above the law, especially not those sworn to uphold it. Back at the bar that evening, Richards watched the press conference on the same TV. His phone buzzed with a message from his lawyer. Don't talk to anyone. Criminal charges filed. Meeting tomorrow 8 a.m. The bartender, who had served him drinks for years, placed the bill in front of him. I think you should pay up and leave, he said coldly. We don't need your kind in here. Richards looked around at the hostile faces watching him. How had it come to this? One traffic stop. One black grandmother who refused to be intimidated. One moment of truth caught on camera. As he walked to his car, he noticed a flyer taped to a streetlight, Elena Johnson's face above the words Town Hall Meeting, Reforming Our Police, tomorrow at 7 p.m. For a moment, he considered going. To say what, he wasn't sure. Sorry, it wasn't enough. Nothing would be enough. But as he unlocked his car, a strange thought occurred to him. Maybe Eleanor Johnson had done him a favor. Maybe she'd stopped him before he became something even worse than what he already was. 6 months later, Eleanor stood on the steps of City Hall again, but this time with a very different feeling in her heart. Behind her stood the mayor, the police chief, and all 9 city council members. Before her stretched a crowd of hundreds, including reporters from national news outlets. A large banner hung from the building, Johnson Accountability Act, a new era of policing. Eleanor adjusted the microphone, glancing down at her grandchildren in the front row. Little Kevin gave her a thumbs up, his smile bright and unafraid. Beside him, Zoe and Thomas held up handmade signs saying Grandma changed the world. Their mother Lisa stood behind them, eyes shining with pride. 6 months ago, I was handcuffed on the side of the road for asking a simple question, Eleanor began. Today, we ensure that no one in our city will ever face that injustice again without consequences. The crowd applauded as Eleanor outlined the changes that would take effect at midnight. Body cameras that couldn't be switched off, civilian review boards with actual power, mandatory bias training, and most importantly, immediate termination for officers who showed racial bias in their policing. This isn't just a piece of paper, Eleanor said, holding up the document. This is a promise to our children that they will be seen as citizens to protect, not threats to control. As she spoke, Eleanor spotted familiar faces throughout the crowd. Mrs. Wilson from next door was there, of course. So was Officer Bell, who had risked his career to testify against his fellow officers. Even some of the officers who had been at the station the day of her arrest were present, many now wearing blue pins that read, "Change from within." What happened to the officers who arrested me? Eleanor continued, addressing the question everyone had been asking. As you know, they were fired from the force and faced criminal charges. Yesterday, they accepted a plea deal that requires them to complete community service in the neighborhoods they once policed, along with public apologies and probation. She paused, choosing her next words carefully. Some people wanted harsher punishment, but true justice isn't about revenge. It's about transformation of individuals and systems. These former officers will now spend 2 years working under the supervision of community leaders who once feared them. They will learn the names and stories of people they once saw only as statistics. After the ceremony, Eleanor and her family held a small celebration at their home. As adults chatted over cake and punch, Thomas pulled his grandmother aside. I got an A on my essay about you, he said proudly, handing her the paper with a red A+ at the top. Eleanor read it quietly, tears forming in her eyes. Thomas had written not just about her credentials or the case, but about watching her remain dignified even when treated unfairly, about how she had transformed her pain into purpose. My grandma taught me that even when you can't control what happens to you, you can control how you respond, he had written. And sometimes the worst days of your life can become the most important days for other people. Eleanor hugged him tightly. You understand perfectly, sweetheart. Later that evening, as guests departed, Eleanor sat on the porch swing with Kevin, who had been unusually quiet all day. What's on your mind, little one? She asked softly. Kevin looked up at her. Miss Chen at school said you're a hero now. Eleanor smiled. What do you think about that? I think you were always a hero, he said simply, but now everybody knows it. He leaned against her shoulder, and they swung gently as dusk settled over the neighborhood. From a distance came the sound of a police siren, and Elena noticed something remarkable. Kevin didn't flinch or look frightened as he once would have. The next morning, Elena waited at the community center where she now ran weekly dialogues between police officers and neighborhood residents. A young officer she hadn't met before approached hesitantly. "Mrs. Johnson, I'm Officer Rodriguez, newly graduated from the academy. I requested this district specifically because of your program." She shifted nervously. "I grew up in this neighborhood. Left to become an officer because I wanted to help change things from the inside. But after what happened to you, I almost quit the academy." "Why didn't you?" Eleanor asked. "Because then I heard you say we need good officers more than ever." Rodriguez straightened her shoulders. "I wanted to thank you for not giving up on the possibility that policing can change." As community members began arriving for the dialogue session, Eleanor introduced Officer Rodriguez to her neighbors. She watched as initial wariness gave way to cautious conversation. That evening, driving her grandchildren home from school, Eleanor noticed a police car behind her at a stoplight. Kevin spotted it too, but instead of shrinking down in his seat, he waved. The officer waved back. "See, Grandma," Kevin said, "it's working." Eleanor smiled, thinking of all the work still to be done, all the conversations yet to be had, all the policies yet to be changed across the country. But for this moment in this car with her grandchildren, she allowed herself to feel the simple joy of progress. "Yes, sweetheart," she said, driving forward as the light turned green. "It's working."